Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, this week, we're going to continue our series looking at the reliability of the Bible. And I think the best way to proceed, I know we've been talking about this idea of, well, how are things passed down in a culture that relied upon the oral transmission of data? How is that done? I think before we do that, it's important to understand, well, how many years are we talking about here? How many years would we have had to have relied on that before we reach the point where the Bible was committed to writing? And I think that's going to be really important. So I want to take a little detour here, and then we'll come back around after we do this to the question, well, how were things passed on orally? Are the form critics right that things were just kind of willy-nilly thrown out there? Or is there good reason to believe that these things were done very carefully in a very controlled environment? And I think we'll see good answers to that when we really sit down and look at that. So when we look at this question of when were the Gospels committed to writing, you're going to find a wide range of opinions out there. Some people, like the form critics, would argue that they were committed to writing well into the 2nd century. And what you'll find is that number keeps shrinking further and further backward into the past. And as modern day scholarship has looked at this question, like many of the other ideas of the form critics, this idea that the Gospels were written late really has started to lose favor and has started to shift to a much, much earlier dating of the Gospels. And we're going to talk about why that is this evening. I love this quote. Our old friend Richard Dawkins, we have not quoted from Richard Dawkins in a while, and we probably won't find much reason to as we go forward talking about the reliability of the Bible. But how can we leave him behind? Richard Dawkins talking about this idea, and you have to love how he works insults into his work from the God Delusion. The fact that something is written down is persuasive to people not used to asking questions like, who wrote it and when? How did they know what to write? Did they, in their time, really mean what we in our time understand them to be saying? Were they unbiased observers, or did they have an agenda that colored their writing? I just have to pause for a minute. I love when people say that and look at people and say, well, are they unbiased in their writing? The God Delusion is one of the most heavily biased works I've ever read in my life, and I don't think Dawkins hides that at all. But I do find it a bit ironic that he throws that charge out there that were the people writing the document completely unbiased in what they did, especially given the work that he's completed there and how incredibly insulting it is to anybody who is a person of faith. But anyway, I digress. He continues, ever since the 19th century, the form critics, ever since the 19th century, scholarly theologians have made an overwhelming case that the Gospels are not reliable accounts of what happened in the history of the real world. We talked about the form critics. All were written long after the death of Jesus and also after the epistles of Paul, which mention almost none of the alleged facts of Jesus' life. Okay, so Richard Dawkins, much like I look at so much of his work, and he is grounded soundly in the 1860s in the work of Charles Darwin. And really, it feels like at the same time, he is grounded heavily in the theological and scholarly work of the form critics, whose work also dates back into the 1800s. Modern day scholarship will disagree with a great deal of what he said. To his credit, he dates his ideas back to the 19th century. But there is a growing understanding and belief. Not only are the Gospels written much earlier than what he contends, but there's also an enormous amount of historical reliability that we will talk about. There are moments in time, and this is what we're going to do over the next few weeks. We're going to lay out a timeline of the things that we know that happened in the early world, things we know from the Bible, from the church fathers, but also from historians outside of the Bible. We want to look at those major events that occurred. And there's going to be a couple of driving events that really wrap around everything that we see happening. And we know when these events occurred. And this is going to drive our analysis over the next 3-4 weeks as we look at all of this. I think jumping into the history of this is fascinating. And I really hope you enjoy where we're about to go, because I love the history aspect of this. Richard Bauckham kind of counters that idea, not countering Dawkins directly, but this idea. And he's talking about the form critics. He says, such skepticism has become endemic in gospel studies as a result of form criticism. Many New Testament scholars seem to suppose that the more skeptical of the sources they are, the more rigorously historical is their method. But this is not how historians usually work. In good historical work, it is no more an epistemic virtue to be skeptical than it is to be credulous. In everyday life, we do not systematically mistrust everything anyone tells us. When someone who is in a position to know what they tell us does so, we normally believe them. The idea of eyewitnesses can be important. But we keep our critical faculties alert and raise questions if there is a specific reason to doubt. There's no reason why historical work should be substantially different in its dialect of trust and critical assessment. He's exactly right. As long as what we're seeing from a reliable source, again, and that's going to be the whole crux of the matter, is the source reliable? So what we're going to be looking for is, were these written early enough to be written by eyewitnesses, or have they been passed on, as the form critics contended, kind of willy-nilly? Just they throw it out there and the ideas just evolved on their own and there was no control over them. Does that make sense in light of what we saw? And then when we logically look at this, when do we think the Gospels really were committed to writing? What does that actually look like? Now, there are going to be two critically important dates in all of this that are really going to kind of box in what we're talking about here. Obviously, the first one's going to be very straightforward. When did Jesus actually die? And from a historical perspective, the date that's usually considered the likely date that Jesus passed away would have been in 33 AD at Passover. There's also a possibility it was 30 AD. But again, the dating system, at that point, no one was dating things. Why? It's the year 33 AD. That did come along later. So most historians will conclude it was either 30 AD or 33 AD when Jesus is crucified and passes away. I think the majority would probably lean towards 33 AD as being the likely date. So that's going to be our beginning point. From 33 AD going forward, how long did it take for these things to start being committed to writing? And how were they passed on in the meanwhile before they got to that point? The other date that is going to be critically important that influences so much of the ancient world in all of this is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman general Titus, the future emperor Titus, in 70 AD. That is going to be a watershed event in this part of the world. It's a huge event no matter what. When the Roman army came in and destroyed Jerusalem, and from a historical perspective, the first Jewish revolt begins around 66 AD in response to some really horrible actions on the part of some Roman governors and leaders. The Jewish people rise up in revolt. And what starts as a small revolt grows tremendously because early on, the Jewish rebels have success and actually defeat the Romans, which you can argue is going to result in a really, really bad outcome because the Romans are going to respond after the initial defeat with a much larger force, again, in what becomes a much larger battle, taking up all of Judea at that point and going from area to area. The Roman general Vespasian, when this all begins, Nero is the emperor. But in 68 AD, Nero's going to die, and his lead general, Vespasian, ultimately becomes the emperor at that point, and he will leave the battle to head to Rome, and he leaves his son Titus as the general in charge leading the battle, and it will be Titus who will ultimately lead to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So all of this is going to come together, but these events touch everything that's going to be in our narrative. In 68 AD, Nero's death, this is going to help us time some things because it's Nero who's ultimately going to put Peter and Paul to death. And so we have kind of a box end again of when things are happening. So as we look at this and the events that happen, we find two enormously important events. And what happens in between 33 AD when Jesus dies and is resurrected, and what happens in 70 AD when Jerusalem falls, we're going to find that shapes our narrative going forward. And it's also going to tremendously help us as we look to date when some of these things happen. There's going to be a couple different schools of thought in all of this. One of them is the Gospels reference Jesus' prophecy that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and the temple is going to be destroyed along with it. Now, at the time, it is an it's just an audacious claim. There will be a great many who will say that shows us that the Gospels were written late. They had to be written after 70 AD because there's no way Jesus could have known that. And that if he did know that, that would constitute a miracle. And so some people, many people, who want to push the Gospels off to a later date will look at that and say, if the Gospels contain the destruction of Jerusalem, then the Gospels had to be written historically after it happened. They could not have been written before. The problem is that doesn't work in terms of the timing. And the only way you get to that is to look at this with a prejudice that miracles cannot happen, that Jesus could not have known what was coming and that Jerusalem would ultimately be destroyed. If you take out that assumption that he couldn't possibly have known, very quickly what you find is the Gospels rapidly slide in, and the best dating of the Gospels is well before 70 AD. We're going to talk about why that is in the weeks to come. But those are going to be the predominant events that we see happen that drives all of this. So in the weeks to come, we're going to fill in this gap. What are the major events that happen between 33 AD, when Jesus likely dies and is resurrected, and then 70 AD, when Jerusalem is destroyed? Because so much Jewish culture and the history and everything that's going to be discussed in the Gospels, the entire narrative of what's going on in the Gospels, and again, a lot of the early church and things like that, all of that is destroyed when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. The Roman historian Josephus, the Jewish historian, also Roman historian Josephus, puts the estimate at well over 1 million people will die in the siege of Jerusalem. Let that number sink in for a minute. 1 million people. That's a number that it's hard for us to comprehend. The scale of the suffering, and a lot of it was starvation. Jerusalem, Titus arrives, the army arrives at the worst possible time of year. You've got Passover pilgrims who are there. You've got people who are fleeing the Roman army from the defeats that they've been suffering on the battlefield. All of it comes together in Jerusalem, and hundreds of thousands of people starve to death before the actual battle ever gets there. And those who don't starve to death are ultimately slaughtered in the battle that comes. Over 1 million people. It's just difficult to imagine an event like that from our perspective all of these years later. So looking back on that, that's what we're going to see as we go forward. So this is going to be our first episode this week. Next week, we're going to start someplace kind of interesting. All of the post-resurrection experiences. We're going to talk about proof of the resurrection down the road. We've talked about that in those first couple episodes. If you want to go back, those very first episodes, we talked about proof of the resurrection. Really good episodes. I'd strongly recommend you go back to them. They're in the first 10 episodes of the podcast. But we're going to talk about the post-resurrection appearances because it's important to note, Jesus didn't just show up once. When the disciples and his followers claim to have seen the physically resurrected and healed Jesus, remember, he's killed by the Romans. He's basically almost beaten to death in a punishment known as scourging. Then he's crucified. After he dies on the cross, a Roman soldier takes a spear and rams it into his heart just to make sure he's dead. 3 days later, the disciples will see, the followers of Jesus will see him resurrected from the dead, physically resurrected and healed. And that just doesn't happen on its own. So we're going to talk about the why part. We're going to talk about all of that down the road. But for the next few weeks, we're going to put together a timeline. And I think it's going to be really interesting from a historical perspective. There are a great many things that happen between 33 AD and 70 AD that you may not have thought of that are going to help us pin down when was it that the Gospels were likely committed to writing. Again, this will be my opinion, but I think it's the opinion of a growing group of scholarship of people who look at this and say, this is how this likely fell into place. We're going to look at the commentary of the early church fathers. We're going to look at these important events in the early church, the timeline of which is not controversial for many of them, the timeline of which we pretty well know a lot of these. And when you bring them all together and look at it, and then bring in, when were Paul's letters written? When were the Gospels written? What you're going to find is there is not a lot of gap between 33 AD and when the first Gospels would have been committed to writing. And that's what we're going to look at starting next week. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. If you're following us on another platform like iTunes or Spotify, I hope you'll consider following us there. If you've got questions, please don't hesitate to reach out via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. If you've got questions, there's also helpful information on our website at prooftograce.com. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope to see you next time as we start jumping into what are those major events? What does that timeline look like from 33 AD to 70 AD, and what was it that happened during those years that carries forward to us today? Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.